the Oregon Legislature now has facilities to rival those of practically any other state assembly.
My name is Phil Lang, and I was born in Portland, Oregon. My great-grandfather settled in the east side of Portland, Oregon in 1848. At that time, he came from Kentucky with 4 of his brothers, and each of them had donation land claims. So I'm a real pioneer of the state of Oregon. One of the things that's most astounding is that my mother was 48 and my father was almost 52 when I was born. And I was born in December of 1929, which because of the economic condition in this country at the time, was pretty good indication that I was not a planned offspring. My father was in the printing business, actually ran newspapers in several small towns, and then they moved back to Portland, and he ran just a printing business without a newspaper in the Portland area. One of the places that we lived in, this was during the early to the mid-30s, there was a large field across the street, and we were probably 1.5 miles from the railroad tracks, the Southern Pacific Railroad tracks. And it was not unusual at all for the people who were riding the rails to knock on our door wanting something to eat. And then they would go across the street in this large field and build a fire and cook and sleep overnight maybe, and then the next day they would be gone. And it got to the point that we sort of joked in the family that we figured that our address was somewhere where these people were getting off or getting on their trains, so that they would know where they could go to get a handout so they would have something to eat. My father was a very strong Democrat. As a young man, he had actually run for county clerk in Clackamas County and wasn't successful, but he stayed active in the party. And so I grew up with that going on all around me. I can recall pulling my wagon around with a box full of sample ballots and campaign literature, and going door to door in our precinct handing out sample ballots and campaign literature. So, you know, from that party standpoint, I got a pretty early start. A young man who was a resident of Arlington worked in my father's print shop when he wasn't in school, and his name was Earl Snell. And Earl Snell became governor of the state of Oregon. He was a legislator both in the House and in the Senate, and I was in school at the time that he was governor. And we were doing history classes and those kinds of classes that you do in school, and I made an appointment to come to see him here in Salem. I came down here on the bus to see him. And I got off the bus at the bus station, the Greyhound station here in Salem, and realized I had a hole in the back of one of my socks. And, you know, I just couldn't believe that I could be seeing the governor and I having a hole in my sock. So I stopped by one of the 5 and dime stores here in Salem and bought a pair of socks and came in the entrance that's out here on Court Street, and there's a man's restroom off to the left there. And I remember going in there, pulling off the socks I had worn down here and putting on the new socks before I went up to the governor's office to see the governor. I actually was interested in law enforcement because in the service I went through training as a special agent for Air Force intelligence, and that's the work that I did when I was in the Air Force. And I was probably the youngest person, or one of the very youngest, that had ever been selected for that kind of work, because they did have a minimum age that had to be waived by Air Force headquarters in Washington, D.C. in order for me to attend the training that I went through. I ended up, during the time that I was in the service, spending most of my time working with the repatriation of the Japanese prisoners of war from Siberia. I went into service and then came back and went to Lewis and Clark. I ran for student body president at Lewis and Clark and was not successful. My major in Lewis and Clark was sociology. Well, I went to the state police because in sociology my emphasis was criminology by that time, and because of the training I had had as a special agent for Air Force intelligence, that had really whetted my appetite, and so I spent a couple of years on the state police force, and I decided that I really wanted to do something else, and I returned to Portland and entered law school. I enjoyed it. I really did. I think I probably am competitive enough and that I would have liked to practice law. I did not finish law school. And in fact, when I retired from business, I thought about the possibility of going back. Because of my law enforcement background, an opening came about for sheriff of Multnomah County. And I had been active in the Democratic Central Committee, and I put my name in the hat. And I was one of the 3 people who were recommended to replace Terry Shrunk, who had been elected mayor of Portland. He had been the sheriff of Multnomah County. He asked me to be his executive assistant when he became mayor. And I decided that was something that I would like to do, and so I did that. One of the funny things that not a lot of people knew about, or even know about now in connection with my service with Terry, is that he had a boy that was at Roosevelt High School that he was very concerned that he not do something that would bring any discredit on him as mayor of the city of Portland. Well, that boy is Mike Shrunk, who has been district attorney in Multnomah County for a number of years, and one of my charges was to sort of keep my eye on Mike. And the person who had been appointed as sheriff was running for re-election, and so I decided to run against him, and I did, and I obviously was not elected. He was re-elected and served for 4 more years, and then 2 years from the time I ran for sheriff, I ran for the House of Representatives, and that came about sort of by accident, because I had returned to, in the interim, I had returned to the insurance business, and I just didn't see any way clear of, approaching my employer and saying I'd like to run for the legislature. And the next thing I knew, the vice president of the company was calling me into his office and saying, "I understand that you'd like to run for the legislature." Well, it was a domestic company based here only in Oregon, doing business at that time only in Oregon. So they had legislative interests, certainly, and they encouraged it, and I ran and I won. I spent less than $500 in that primary campaign, and I was elected. This was a much different place in those days. The House floor was your office. The secretaries sat with you at your desk, and there was a place that is, I think now, a caucus room that was the typing pool. There weren't enough typewriters for all the secretaries, so it was the scramble to get them to use them. And none of them were electric. They were all old manual typewriters. The salary was fixed in the Constitution at the time, was $50 a month. The Secretary of State actually issued the checks then, and all your supplies came through the Secretary of State, because we didn't have a infrastructure for the legislature like exists now. There was no legislative administration or any of those services. The Speaker of the House at that first session was Bob Duncan, who then went to Congress from Medford. The only person that was elected and the only member who was younger than I in the '61 session was Bob Smith, who later became Speaker of the House and then was elected to Congress. But out of the freshman class, Ed Fadley was one of the members of the freshman class, and Cornelius Bateson was from here in Marion County, Ross Morgan from East Multnomah County. There were about 22 of us that were freshmen, I believe, during that '61 session. Having had some law school, I'm sure Bob figured it was important that someone with some knowledge or background, and having been in law enforcement and also adjusting claims. And anyway, I ended up on the Judiciary Committee. The shift from the Republicans to the Democrats took place in '72. Well, initially there were 4 of us that were candidates for Speaker. Dick Hyman and Keith Skelton and Les Aucoin and myself. The voting process was secret ballot, and the person with the fewest votes dropped off. And the first one to drop off was Keith Skelton. And the second one to drop off was Les Aucoin. And Les Aucoin then met with the people who had been supporting him and urged them to vote for Dick Hyman. Anyway, went to Dick, and Dick was elected Speaker of the House. And I was elected Speaker Pro Tem and appointed as Chairman of the full Committee on Ways and Means. And then during the interim, looked like Dick Hyman wouldn't be returning to the House in the '74 election and the '75 session, and so I became an active candidate for Speaker. I went to people, all Democrats who had been elected all over the state. I actually had someone fly me in a private plane so that I could have a face-to-face talk with them and talk to them about what their interests were and how I might be able to satisfy those interests. And anyway, I was elected Speaker, and Ed Lindquist was elected Majority Leader.
One of the things that we see developing is the fact that the legislative committees are going to other parts geographically of the state.
During the time that I was Speaker, both the '75 and the '77 sessions, I would invite the new members into the Speaker's office. I had a large conference table in there to lunch, and we'd have lunch brought down from the lounge, and we'd sit down and talk about what their interests were and what they were expecting to accomplish and all those kinds of things. And as they left, I had copies made of the interim committee page out of the 1929 Blue Book. And I did that mainly because that was the year I was born, you know. But the interim committees were things like legislative reform, workers' compensation, drug traffic along the Pacific coast, you know, you go down the list, and the point I was trying to drive home to them, new members come here with the feeling and idea that they're going to change the whole world overnight, is that you don't do that. You don't change the whole world overnight, and that many of the issues are with us forever, and we are solving them only temporarily with the things that we do. And I think that's something that new legislators need to know. Well, one of the things I did after the caucus, both in 75 and 77, was to ask of all of the members to list the committees that they were interested in, most interested in. And I looked for people for the chairmanships, people who had served on the committees that had dealt with those issues previously. So, because you need to have someone, if at all possible, who is going to be chairman that has a history and an experience with those issues. Historical knowledge of the legislature and the legislative process is very, very important in getting to the right policy decisions. I had a big magnetic board that had the committees listed, and I had names, and I sort of locked myself up in my townhouse that I rented just north of town, and spent several days working names into these committees so that people that were assigned to the committees wouldn't have conflicts as far as when the other committee that they were on was meeting. And one of the other things I insisted on in both sessions, that people who served on Ways and Means had no other committee assignments, that they had their time dedicated to the process of appropriations. And that was a given. If they really wanted to be on Ways and Means, they knew they were going to have to give up serving on other committees. But that was an interesting process, and I did it by myself. I did it without help. The 73 session had gone longer than any previous legislative session in history, and the observers of the process were pretty upset about it. The media, the editorialized against it and everything. And one of the things that Dick did that I didn't feel was necessary, he insisted that every single bill that was introduced have a hearing. Well, that was very time consuming. I didn't feel that was necessary, so I tried to appoint very strong chairmen and people who I could just trust with the issues that they were going to be dealing with. I did not try to force issues through committees. Well, during my first session, there was a fellow from East Multnomah County who was my chair of Ways and Means, Harvey Akeson. But he had served on Ways and Means, and he had pretty much of a photographic memory, and that helps when you're dealing with as many figures as you do in Ways and Means. Dick Magruder was chair of Judiciary, and Earl Blumenauer was my chair of Revenue and School Finance. In the 77 session, I appointed Vera Katz chairman of Ways and Means. She's the first woman that had ever chaired the committee, and of course she was the first woman ever to be elected Speaker of the House. My labor chairman in the 77 session was Ted Kulongowski. And you know, that I think sort of speaks for itself that these were strong individuals, and those were the kind of people that I was looking for to chair my committees. I believe in letting the process work, and I don't believe in any individual in a leadership position at the legislative level trying to force only their program. I know I have a lot of people who disagree with me, but I think that citizens of the state and this nation would be much better off if the congressional or the legislative leadership did not try to force their own personal agenda. The state seal, I just thought that the rostrum looked sort of bare without something being there. And, you know, at the federal level, they have the U.S. seal or the seal of the president or the seal of whoever it is that's doing the speaking, and they put it on the rostrum. So I had that installed on the rostrum. I prided myself in the fact that I knew the rules better than anyone else in the House, including the staff. So I didn't rely on someone to be my parliamentarian. And I knew the process. I knew the script. Right now they have a written script for dealing with the day-to-day procedures of the House. I didn't use that. I didn't need to, because, you know, I knew what it was. One of the interesting things in the changes in the process that I did, and the Senate didn't adopt it right away, but they did later, is the Constitution requires 3 readings of a bill before it's passed. And we always used to do the first reading and the second reading, and then it was referred to committee, and it came back out from committee, and then they did the third reading and the passage. Well over half the bills never come out of committee. So why do the second reading until it comes back out of committee? Because the Constitution doesn't say it has to go to second reading before it goes to committee. So we eliminated that. I worked very closely with the Straub administration on to do something about field burning. I got myself into quite a bit of difficulty over that one, because after spending time with the governor and with his staff, I appointed a special committee on field burning, and I appointed myself chairman, and we dealt with that legislation. And along the way, I had balanced the committee very carefully, making sure that the field burning interests had some voice on the committee, but making sure that we had the right number of votes to get the legislation out that the governor really was pushing for, which was a smoke management approach to it. And one of the members representing the area for the field burners, Lynn County, that area, had a massive heart attack and was in the hospital. So trying to make sure that those field burning interests didn't feel that they were being cut out, I appointed someone in his place and failed to remove him from the committee. And we were having a Saturday morning meeting, and he walked about 3 days after he had had open heart surgery, 4 days maybe, you know. So I had a problem on my hands immediately, because that was actually the meeting that I wanted to move the bill and get it out to the floor so we could get action on it. So I recessed the committee, and I closed one of the doors fairly hard on one of the members of the press, and wouldn't open it, wouldn't let them in. And as a result, the Associated Press and the Oregon Newspaper Publishers Association and the Eugene Register Guard filed suit against me as violating the open meetings law. Well, at that time, the open meetings did not apply to the legislature. In the first place, there weren't enough of us together. There wasn't a majority of the committee. So there wasn't no violation if the law had applied. But nevertheless, they filed the lawsuit against me, and we went to court, and the case was dismissed. Well, one of the things in the case of Dick Magruder, there were 2 things probably. He had been chairman of Judiciary, and he wanted to serve on Ways and Means, but he still wanted to retain his chairmanship of Judiciary. And like I had indicated previously, that wasn't in the cards as far as I was concerned. You did one or the other. And so I put him on Ways and Means and appointed Hardy Myers as chairman of Judiciary. And that, I'm sure, ruffled his feathers a little. But you know, he got over that, I think, fairly rapidly. He introduced a fairly extensive bill on water resources. I said, do you get together the people that you want to serve on a special committee on water resources and come back to me and I'll appoint a special committee and appoint you as chairman of the special committee. Well, he just didn't ever get back to me. So the bill sat in my desk drawer. I didn't assign it to committee. And I wasn't, because I didn't have a committee really to assign it to. That created a lot of unrest, and he started stirring other people up in regard to it. And the Republicans then saw a chance to, with a coalition, to try to attack me in some way. They initially talked about trying to replace me as Speaker. Well, there were enough of the Republican caucus that didn't want any part of that, they didn't have the votes to do that. And looking back on it, I probably could have really settled the argument just totally if I had stepped aside and run again, you know, withdrawn and run again for Speaker. That didn't happen, and I didn't resign. I thought about it, and in fact, at one point had delivered a resignation to the Secretary of State's office, but withdrew it. And so they were successful in modifying the rules on bill assignments. And this all happened, though, in May. They formed a special committee to do a bill assignments. Well, most of the bills that were coming to us from the Senate that had been passed in the Senate. And, you know, it just wasn't that big a deal. Then they continued that special committee into the interim. And the only way that they affected my power or authority during that interim period was the rules required that any committees that I appointed or formed had to have their approval. But they didn't have the power to initiate any of it. So if they didn't approve something and I didn't, you know, change it or didn't initiate it, nothing got done. And they finally, the majority of that committee finally quickly realized that they were in a position to do nothing but just to really approve what I proposed. And a few of the members got very aggravated because they had gotten sort of caught up in their own process, which was somewhat amusing to me at the time. But also, some of them got really nasty at a couple of the meetings that we had of the special committee. I think we actually, from a standpoint of legislation, had a very successful session, regardless of all that.
Governor Straub, President Bowe, distinguished guests, I'm proud to participate in the dedication of this beautiful and needed capital expansion.
Speaker Iman had an idea of building an addition to the Capitol that was underground to the west of the Capitol building in Wilson Park, and then building the park back over the underground facility. Well, not only was it not very practical, because there are certain times of the year that the water table in the Salem area is very high. But, you know, not having outside windows in a large facility like that and having it all underground brought a lot of opposition to it. But it was that idea was in recognition of the need to have additional space because legislators didn't have individual offices. So during the 75 session, the President of the Senate and I spent quite a bit of time together just talking about what we thought needed to be done. And in fact, we talked to some architectural firms about some concepts. We ended that session with a $1 expenditure limitation in the legislative budget for capital construction. The Emergency Board met to organize immediately upon adjournment sine die that evening. And we increased the $1 expenditure limitation, and I don't recall the exact figure, but I think it was to $13 million. The firm that we had been talking with about the concepts had some preliminary drawings, and they were hired. And at the month later at the emergency board meeting, the contractor was hired. And while they broke ground, my guess is it was within 45 days after we had adjourned sine die in order to start construction on the Capitol addition of the wings. As a result, though, of all this going on, Jason Bowe, President of the Senate, was still practicing optometry in Reedsport and just couldn't be here. And I was 50 miles away, so I would work until noon in Portland at the insurance company and get in my car and head for Salem, be in the office here in the afternoon, stay in my townhouse overnight, come back the next morning here, and drive at noon back to the insurance company. It was just back and forth during that period of time. And one of the main reasons for it is that, as anyone knows, with a large construction project, there are change orders that need to be okayed. And, even though legislative administration was charged with the oversight, the final person that they looked for to sign off on the change orders was either one of the presiding officers. So I really had to be here. The leader of the Republican Party in the House, Roger Martin, filed suit against the Oregon Building Authority, and that took it to the Supreme Court, and they decided that it was unconstitutional. But by that time, the money had been spent and the wings had been built. The bill was introduced in the Senate and passed the Senate quite rapidly, and came to the House, and we brought it to the floor, and there weren't enough votes to pass it, even though we had a majority. The Democrats had a majority in the House, but it was the beginning of a sort of disaffection of some of the Democrats at the time, and it was a solid no vote from the Republicans. Well, I left the rostrum and went back into the Speaker's office and called Roger into the office because he was Majority Leader. I said, this has got to pass. And I said, you know it as well as anyone, is that we've got to restore the money to the state treasurer. And I said, I think that you need to probably meet with your members in caucus and explain to them that perhaps they're going to have to vacate their offices, those people who are voting against this appropriation bill. And so anyway, they held a caucus, and they came back onto the floor, and there were more than enough votes to pass the appropriation. They were just playing fun and games, is all, and to make me sweat a little. I think that basically most of the people really thought that they had turned out well, and that everyone knew that we needed the space, and I think they thought it was what needed to be done at the time. And actually it turned out, I think, that there was that window in time where they could be built, and for the amount of money that they were built for, to try and duplicate that amount of space for that kind of money and to furnish it. Because if you'll recall, just shortly after that, we went into double-digit inflation, and things would have just escalated beyond where we probably could have done anything about it in a short period of time. Certainly within 4 years, we would not have been able to do it, because by that time, we were into a recession. It was much better than I've observed it to be, and I think there are a lot of external reasons for that. One of the things is that our office was on the floor, and so we had a lot of give and take with each other when we weren't in committees. And we had that same give and take with people of the opposite party. And as a result, there was a better relationship between the two parties, I think. We could go toe-to-toe on the floor on issues and walk off the floor with our arms around each other and socialize together. And we did that, and we got along, I think, a lot better. There were not many just straight-out party line votes. The party line vote took place on organization and on rules, on upholding the ruling of the chair or something like that. But on issues, we had a lot of Democrats that were elected from Central and Eastern Oregon. And if you expected those people to vote for something that their community didn't want and the people here in the Valley or the Portland metropolitan area did, they weren't going to be here at the next session. You know, in order to have and exercise the leadership necessary to do things, you have to be in control. I was a committee chairman under a Republican speaker, and there were other Democrats who were appointed chairman. And so, you know, there was that attempt at trying to keep the partisanship out of the process as much as possibly could be. And that helped strengthen the relationship within the legislature, but also our relationship with the executive, in that we were getting a lot of good legislation beginning to develop in the area of land use and all those kinds of things. Well, I didn't see as much special interest prevailing, because the give and take of the philosophy of the members of the two parties was having more to do with the establishment of the public policy than where the campaign finances were coming from. Well, I think there was a great deal of pride in some of the things that we were doing first. We led the way in doing certain things from a public policy standpoint at the state level. And I think there was a great deal of pride here in Oregon. And I think there was a resistance to those outside influences.
You have to recognize that they're advocates, that they're representing special interests, and that they're going to voluntarily tell you about those things that support their point of view.
I ran again. Well, the Republicans recruited a candidate, and the newspapers didn't endorse me, and I was defeated. The thing they put out is that in trying to streamline the process, we started doing a lot of pre-session bill filing. And that's something that the President of the Senate and I really initiated during the time that we were in office. We showed that the bills were introduced by order of the Speaker or by order of the President, and these were the interim committee bills. And there was a bill that dealt with taxing at a lower level fraternal organizations and churches for basic police and fire services that they get. And they used that in the campaign against me, as though that was my bill. Well, it was strictly, you know, an administrative thing that had occurred. But by the time that I realized what was going on, it was too late to respond to it. And I think that had more to do with my defeat than almost anything. The only sad part about it, after 18 years, you know, that's a long time to serve. The only sad part looking back on it is the fact that the woman who defeated me only served one term because she didn't like it. But, you know, she had really been recruited and pushed by the Republican Party to oppose me. And actually, you know, collegial towards each other today. The month of my 65th birthday, I retired from the insurance business. And I thought I was going to have a lot of time on my hands to do things that I really enjoyed. The person who had done my sort of flack work, press and contact and things like that, was the legal assistant to the governor, Chet. And he just didn't think that I should have that kind of time on my hands. And so they cooked up this idea of me becoming chairman of the Oregon Liquor Control Commission. The governor really wanted to change in direction. The commission, he felt, had been too lax in its enforcement and its regulation of the alcohol beverage industry. And he appointed me as chairman, and former Republican House Majority Leader as one of the members at the same time, Ray Baum. And we have made a difference. We have changed the direction of the commission. Well, to be thankful I live in America, and that someone like myself could participate to the extent that I did, and to have the influence that I did.